Last time, we talked about keeping up with the Joneses, or more specifically, keeping up with the Joneses Empire, because it's the late 19th century, and anyone who's anyone has some kind of overseas colonial empire. And we talked about basically 4 reasons why most modern superpowers or great powers during this time period had empires. Either it was a demonstration of strength, it was because of the impact of the Second Industrial Revolution. There was also kind of a military and strategic reason behind it. And finally, we also discussed that there were ideas like paternalism and racism that also sort of undergird those attempts at overseas imperial expansion. And also even evangelism, the idea that there were non-Christians in uncolonized territory, and that it would be better for them if they be converted to Christianity. So those are the basic 4 reasons why we see the expansion of empire during this time period. Now, that being said, that doesn't really talk specifically about the United States. So the question is, how does the United States imperial expansion sort of begin? And remember, there's a good sort of debate as to where you want to date that process. So remember that manifest destiny has kind of always been a thing. And the question is, what is really the difference between manifest destiny and overseas colonization? Is it really a difference in terms of goals? Is it really a difference in terms of substance? Or is it just like, the process is different? The fact that you're doing one, again, with Conestoga wagons, and you're doing the other with ships. But one of the issues with expansion in U.S. history has always been the great political divide between North and South over the subject of slavery. Remember that anytime the United States was going to expand westwards, that always opened Pandora's box. And the question is that new territory and or state going to adopt slavery, or is it going to be free? And remember that we talked at length about the fact that there were multiple attempts to expand U.S. territory beyond the borders of the United States. But the fact that there were such dire political consequences for doing that meant that overseas expansion, or just expansion in general, was always super risky. Just look at the Mexican-American War. Remember where the United States increased its territory by 1/3. That set a chain of events off that arguably led to the American Civil War. The United States really didn't play much of a role on the world stage because so much of its political energy was spent looking inward rather than outward. Now, of course, that's the case for most countries if you think about it, but the fact that anytime U.S. borders would shift, whether you're incorporating another territory or basically allowing that territory to achieve statehood, it always nearly splits the country apart. Whether you're looking at the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850, territorial expansion has always kind of been a roll of the dice. You might get a bigger country out of the package, but at the same time, you might actually destroy the country. So the end of the Civil War, at the very least, takes slavery off the table, at least politically. Now, of course, the legacy of slavery, the fact that most African Americans are still working as sharecroppers in the South without really any legal protections, and they're still being openly discriminated against because of Jim Crow laws. Well, the legacy of slavery obviously continues. But slavery, at the very least, as a legal institution, is sort of a moot point. Slavery is gone. Now there's no longer that existential question as to whether or not a state or territory is going to be a slave state or a free state. So what happens, almost as soon as the dust settles on the American Civil War, William H. Seward, the American Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, eagerly sets about making the United States a major player on the global stage. So during this time period, the United States is expanding, especially into the West, but also in other non-Western cardinal directions. It's just that the West is the path of least resistance. But remember that if you're looking at U.S. foreign policy over time, a lot of it is based around the idea that the United States doesn't want bigger, more powerful European countries to basically encircle it. That the United States wants to make sure that it is free to expand into the frontier wherever that is. And remember that this was kind of the cornerstone of the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the United States wanted to make sure that there were no other powerful European nations in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, unfortunately for the United States, there were other powerful European nations in the Western Hemisphere. And not only did they freely intervene in the non-United States countries in the Western Hemisphere, but also during the Civil War, Britain and France kind of intervene in that conflict. Kind of also on the side of the South, if you remember. The British, even though realistically the British were never going to, actively intervene in the American Civil War, they still built the Confederate States of America high-tech, ironclad warships. And by the way, the Lincoln administration and the Johnson administration didn't exactly forget that. So maybe that's why when in 1866, William H. Seward encourages British Columbians to basically secede from the British Empire and join the United States, you kind of get the impression that he's maybe motivated by a fair bit of schadenfreude, or maybe, turnabout is fair play. At this point, it also occurs to me that you might not know what the word schadenfreude is, and if you don't, you should remedy that. Like now, close this video and look that up. It'll change your life. Anyhoodles, you might remember that control of British Columbia was a source of frustration to American politicians dating all the way back to disputes over the Oregon Territory, or what the British called Rupert's Land. Like, what a British name, right? Anyway, what Seward decides to do, though, is he decides to apply a little bit more pressure against the British, because he is aware that the westernmost part of Canada, what is now known as Alaska, is actually owned by the Russian Empire, has been for hundreds of years, but the issue is that Russia's never really done anything with it. Partially because, well, if you look at Russia on a map, they have more land and territory as it is. So, Alaska's kind of been just undeveloped for a couple of hundred years. And of course, it's very northern, and so the question is, how can you realistically develop it? That's a good question. We'll answer that in just a minute. But Russia was perennially cash-strapped during the 19th century, and it certainly isn't going to improve very much in the early 20th century. So the recently cash-flushed U.S. decides to offer Russia some $9 million for the purchase of Alaska. The other benefit there is that Russia had recently fought a war with the British a little over 10 years ago called the Crimean War, and they kind of got the snot kicked out of them, embarrassingly, partially because that war was a naval war, and the Tsar realized that any defense of Alaska would require naval superiority against the most powerful naval empire on the face of the earth, Great Britain. So, what the Russians realize is that they get 9 million smackaroos, and they also they essentially make Alaska America's problem. So it's a win-win, theoretically, right? Well, not quite, because the year is 1867. Now, if you know some general dates, you might know that 1867 is very close to a very important event in U.S. history. The end of the American Civil War. So you can kind of forgive people for thinking that dealing with the reconstruction of the American South, the end of slavery and the destruction of its legacies, the destruction of black codes, the suppression of white supremacist groups, the fact that the government itself has become increasingly corrupt as a consequence of the American Civil War, and the fact that nearly 700,000 Americans have lost their lives in a conflict that's raged over 4 years, that, maybe Alaska might not necessarily be priority number one, William H. Seward, but William H. Seward thought it was. And even though he was roundly criticized for trying to buy a block of ice from the Russian Empire, the deal went through. And by the way, shame on me, it was $7.2 million, not $9 million. So I guess Seward got an even bigger bargain than even I remember. Now, yes, people laughed at Seward's expense, but he got the last laugh, or at least he would have if he had lived long enough to see the discovery of gold in the Klondike Mountains of Alaska. And in fact, the discovery of gold is yet again another major gold rush in U.S. history, and probably the largest and most significant gold rush after the discovery of gold in California in 1849. And in fact, the Klondike Gold Rush, it becomes politically important because hopefully you guys remember the frustrations over deflation, how basically the money supply has remained stagnant as the population increases, as goods and services increase, which means that there's this serious demand for basically inflating the money supply. But the problem is that if you're on the gold standard, well then, you can't print more of the stuff. You've got to mine it. And also remember that there's never really been a large quantity of gold in the United States. That's why the Spanish and the Portuguese and pretty much every other European power avoided us. It's nice to feel wanted and appreciated. But with the discovery of gold in the Klondike Mountains, you can kind of see that, suddenly there's a little bit of kind of monetary relief, especially for those farmers in the Midwest who are heavily indebted. Now, unless you're Napoleon Bonaparte or Emperor Palpatine, empires generally don't follow some kind of master plan that's followed from beginning to end. Most empires are just kind of made up as people go along. They're improvised. But what we can say is that America's colonial empire that begins in the 19th century is mostly focused on an area that shouldn't be that surprising to us, and that is, of course, the Western Hemisphere more generally, and specifically Latin American countries. We can see American interest in Latin America sort of begin as early as the Monroe Doctrine. But that interest was more out of concern with what more powerful European empires could do with those countries. But now, what's kind of interesting is that the interests begin to shift a little bit. In the early 19th century, the United States, like most recently freed Latin American countries, was agrarian, right? But what begins to happen is that during the mid-19th century, the United States becomes industrialized. And the thing is that once you become an industrial nation, suddenly you care very deeply about potential new customers. And so the United States begins to kind of focus on Latin America, not just as a security concern, not just because it's like the bed under which European boogeymen could sort of hide under. No, instead, the interest is now to view Latin American countries as either customers for industrial goods or as sources of raw materials for those industrial goods. This is why Grover Cleveland's great rival, James G. Blaine, Secretary of State, remember, under James Garfield, also the guy that gave Charles Guiteau cold shoulder. So, in my opinion, Blaine, at least on one point, was an excellent judge of character. But Blaine basically articulates what becomes known as the Big Sister policy. The Big Sister policy is the idea that the United States should basically become kind of the economic leader of Latin America, and that Latin American countries should basically take down trade barriers and restrictions so that American merchants can basically sell their goods freely. And again, this is a lot about American sort of expanding influence, but a lot of it is just simply a consequence of the Industrial Revolution and how that has changed American interests during this time period. So that being said, even though Latin America is kind of the center, the focus of U.S. interests, is not the only focus. If there is a crown jewel, both then and now, for overseas markets, it's China. Partially, that's just because China was and is the most populous nation on planet Earth. And so China becomes very important, not just to the United States, but to all industrial powers, both as kind of a place to extract resources, but even more importantly, as a market. And you might remember my really terrible reference to the fact that the British couldn't really find anything to sell to the Chinese, so they tried to sell them opium, and when the opium export business was curtailed by the Chinese government, the British go to war with the Chinese government. But we also see the fact that the United States is very interested in expanding its business interests in China during this time period. And that might help explain why there's such a focus on expanding trade infrastructure in the Pacific, because, of course, going from San Francisco to Beijing or Shanghai is kind of a hike. So you need trading ports and naval bases. And remember that that concept is, you can link to one man, well, Alfred Thayer man, who basically argues that trade is really important for a country's strength. To have trade, you need a navy. If you want an effective navy, you need naval bases strategically positioned where your trade is going. Hence why, during the 19th century, early 20th century, the United States manages to acquire Hawaii and American Samoa and Guam. And, of course, a few other countries and island territories that we'll talk about in just a moment. But let's talk about Hawaii, because like most things in history, it's complicated. On the one hand, it gives us this. I would occupy Hawaii for a mustache like Tom Selleck's. On the other hand, Hawaii was only acquired because the United States kind of sort of supported the armed overthrow of another country's government. And that overthrow was accomplished by a guy selling a bunch of pineapples. Yes, this is the origin story of Dole Pineapple. No, I'm not making this up. So believe it or not, in the pre-Magnum PI era, the Dark Ages, I assure you, Hawaii was actually an independent country that was kind of organized like the British government. It had a constitutional monarchy led by Queen Leleokalani. Now, that being said, Americans and Europeans had a lot of influence in the government of Hawaii. In fact, Leleokalani's chief minister, basically the head of her government, kind of a prime minister type figure, was actually an American himself. I think his name was Samuel Colson, by the way. So that just kind of shows you how Americans and Europeans had basically kind of infiltrated the highest reaches of the Hawaiian government. But the most powerful individuals in Hawaii were these sugar planters. And again, Samuel Dole, aka the Pineapple Man, is probably the most powerful of those planters. Now, apparently, if you look at the backstory, there had been a conscious effort by many of these American and European business elites to limit the power and authority of the monarchy. Before Leleokalani actually ascended to the throne, there was a constitution that was basically ratified in the year 1887 called the Bayonet Constitution. And by the way, whenever your constitution is named after bayonets, that's generally not a good sign, because what it involved is the fact that a militia basically approaches, or basically an American and European funded militia, confronts the king of Hawaii and forces him to sign away many of his powers. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, how do they actually get by with this? Generally, strong-arming the king is not going to look that good. But we have to remember that the native population of Hawaii, people of Polynesian descent generally, had their population decimated by many of the same diseases that hurt Native Americans back during the Columbian Exchange. So by the mid-19th century, the native Hawaiian population was actually outnumbered by foreigners. Now, Hawaii was really a melting pot because you had people coming into work from all over. The Portuguese population of Hawaii, by the way, was quite large during this time period. But it does mean that control of the island by the indigenous government is quickly coming to an end by the late 19th century. So when Queen Leleokalani ascends the throne, she sort of makes it known that this whole bayonet constitution thing is rubbish, and she might try to, get a non-bayonet constitution, a constitution that isn't ratified using coercion or force. Well, at this point, Sanford Dole and some of the other sugar planters decide that Queen Leleokalani is just being too demanding, apparently wanting a bayonet-free constitution. So Sanford Dole telephones a group of U.S. Marines that were in the Pacific and tells them to stop by and make a social call. And apparently they do. And it wasn't really authorized or anything. And Queen Leleokalani is overthrown. And you have the creation of a Hawaiian Republic. Now, if you remember what happened in Texas and Western Florida and California, this follows kind of a very similar pattern here, where you have U.S. settlers who are living in foreign territory. They become very powerful and influential, and using that power and influence, they decide that they would just rather eliminate the indigenous government and replace it with one of their own. Despite the fact that they're separated by thousands of miles and basically every other conceivable way that two places can be different from one another, is the fact that Sanford Dole, sort of taking a play out of Texas's playbook, decides to immediately ask the United States government to annex it. Now, there's a problem with this, though, and that is that, unfortunately for Sanford Dole, the President of the United States in the year 1893, which is when all this stuff is going down, is one Grover Cleveland. And remember that Grover Cleveland was asked to help Texas pay for some seed back in the 1880s because the population of Texas was starving or on the risk of starvation, and they didn't know if they would have any, crops to grow for the next year. And Grover Cleveland's like, nah, dog, I don't know that the federal government has the constitutional authority to do that. So let's not try it. So if Grover Cleveland thinks that paying for a bunch of starving people in Texas is sketch, imagine what he thinks about supporting a coup in Hawaii. And yeah, he's not a fan. And so what happens is that for about 4 years, during Cleveland's presidential term, Hawaii is actually an independent country. Now, of course, what happens is that as soon as William McKinley is elected president in 1896, around, the year 1898, Hawaii is formally annexed as a U.S. territory. So, speaking of William McKinley, our next discussion will actually be about the splendid little war that takes place on McKinley's watch, rather in spite of what he wants and desires. Next time we get to the sort of the classic example of American imperialism during this time period, the Spanish-American War.